The greatest information monopoly in American history was built on lies transmitted at the speed of lightning. 1844, Samuel Morse tapped out, "What hath God wrought," across a wire between Washington and Baltimore, and the world changed in an instant. Messages that once took weeks by horse could now travel in seconds. Fortunes would be made, empires built, wars won or lost based on who controlled these electric veins of information. The United States, drunk on manifest destiny, saw the telegraph as divine confirmation of its continental ambitions. From the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, all would be bound by copper wire and electric pulses. But there was a problem. The technology was new, expensive, and experimental. Building telegraph lines required capital, vast amounts of it. Poles, wire, operators, relay stations. Every mile westward cost a fortune. The government watched with interest but kept its purse strings tight. This was America, after all. Let private enterprise solve the problem. Let the market decide. Enter Silas Crawford. A Boston merchant with silver tongue and iron ambition, Crawford understood something fundamental about the telegraph that others missed. It wasn't just a communication device. It was a weapon. Whoever controlled the wires controlled the narrative. Whoever controlled the narrative controlled the market. And whoever controlled the market controlled everything else. In 1846, Crawford secured an exclusive contract from state legislatures to build a telegraph line connecting New York to New Orleans, the commercial arteries of America. North to south. Finance to cotton. The lifeline of the nation's economy threaded on a single wire. The American Telegraph Company was born with fanfare, flags, and a stock offering that promised returns of 40% annually. Newspapers called it the investment of the century. Senators bought shares. Banks lined up to lend. The subscription books filled in days. The facade was flawless. Prospectuses printed on thick paper. Engineering reports stamped with official seals. Testimonials from politicians who'd never seen a telegraph in operation. Crawford stood before crowds in New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, painting visions of instantaneous commerce, of cotton prices transmitted in seconds, of news arriving before it was news. But inside this gleaming facade, Crawford had discovered something dangerous. The telegraph didn't just carry information. It could create it. Reality, he realized, was simply whatever arrived first. And he controlled what arrived first. The line from New York to Philadelphia was completed. Then Philadelphia to Baltimore. Short hops, already proven. But the real money, the continental line to New Orleans, that was different. 2,000 miles through forests, swamps, and hostile territory. It would take years. It would cost millions. Crawford had months and thousands. So he made a choice that would change American finance forever. He wouldn't build the line. He would build the illusion of the line. The scheme was elegant in its simplicity. Crawford's workers laid wire through Pennsylvania, down into Maryland, then stopped. They erected poles at regular intervals along roads where investors might travel, creating the appearance of progress. But the wire itself connected nothing but the existing northern network to Crawford's private office in Philadelphia. From there, he controlled a pipeline of pure fiction flowing directly into the veins of American commerce. The first message came on a humid August morning in 1847. Gold discovered in Louisiana Territory. Massive deposits along Red River. Rush expected. It arrived in New York via American Telegraph Company wire. Within hours, every newspaper in the city carried the story. By evening, shares in Louisiana mining ventures quadrupled. By week's end, American Telegraph stock had climbed 30%. Investors reasoned simply, if the telegraph could bring news this fast, imagine the advantage in future commercial intelligence. The news was completely fabricated. Crawford understood something profound about information in the telegraph age. Speed overwhelmed skepticism. A message arriving by wire carried the weight of truth simply because it arrived impossibly fast. By the time riders from Louisiana reached New York weeks later reporting no gold discovery, the market had moved on to other news. Other Crawford news. Treaty imminent with Mexico. New territories to open for settlement. American telegraph stock climbed. Cotton blight destroying Georgia harvest. Prices expected to surge. Futures contracts shifted. Fortunes changed hands. And with each message, Crawford's company grew more indispensable, more trusted, more valuable. He played the market like a piano, each false note creating a cascade of real money. Competitors smelled blood in the water. But Crawford had the exclusive contract, the infrastructure, and most importantly, the wires. They could build competing lines, but they couldn't compete with the speed of electricity itself. Or so he thought. In Boston, a quiet civil engineer named James Porter studied Crawford's operation with cold mathematical precision. Porter had lost money on the Louisiana gold rush, then lost more when the Mexican treaty never materialized. He began asking uncomfortable questions. Why did all market-moving news arrive exclusively via American telegraph wires? Why did none of it ever prove verifiable through traditional sources? Why did Crawford's stock always surge just before he issued new shares? Porter decided to build his own line. Not to New Orleans, that would take too long. To Richmond, Virginia, via a completely different route using more efficient insulators and lighter gauge wire. It would be faster, cheaper, and most importantly, independently verifiable. He called it the Atlantic and Southern Telegraph. The establishment laughed. Crawford's company had the government contract, the capital, the momentum. But Porter had something Crawford lacked. Integrity. And that would prove more valuable than Crawford ever imagined. Meanwhile, in Crawford's own operation, a telegraph operator named Thomas Becket was drowning in guilt. Every fake dispatch he transmitted felt like a nail in his own coffin. He watched investors ruined, families destroyed, all based on lies that traveled through his fingertips in dots and dashes. One night, working late in the Philadelphia office, Becket made a decision that would unravel everything. He began keeping copies. Every false message. Every fabricated report. Every market manipulation. And he began looking for someone brave enough to publish the truth. The journalist's name was Robert Wells, 26 years old, hungry for the story that would make his career. He worked for the New York Tribune, grinding through minor scandals and society gossip, watching his better-connected peers rise while he remained chained to a desk on the third floor. When Thomas Becket approached him in a dark tavern near the Brooklyn docks, carrying a leather satchel stuffed with telegraph transcripts, Wells understood immediately that this was either his fortune or his funeral. The documents were devastating. Months of fabricated dispatches, carefully catalogued and annotated by Becket. Messages about gold strikes that never happened, treaties that were never signed, disasters that never occurred, all strategically timed to move markets, inflate stock prices, and enrich Crawford and his inner circle. The pattern was unmistakable. False news would arrive via American telegraph wire, stock prices would surge, Crawford would sell shares at the peak, then silence would follow as the news proved false. By then, new investors held the worthless paper. Wells began investigating with the precision of a surgeon. He traveled to Louisiana, no gold. He interviewed government officials in Washington, no Mexican treaty. He tracked down investors who'd lost everything on Crawford's lies. Each interview added weight to the story. Each fact demolished another piece of Crawford's empire. But Crawford wasn't stupid. He noticed the journalist asking questions, noticed his chief telegraph operator acting nervous, noticed his stock price beginning to wobble. He'd built an empire on controlling information. Now information was controlling him. Crawford made his move. He announced plans for the Grand Continental expansion, doubling the telegraph network, reaching California within 2 years, connecting America coast to coast with electric fire. The stock offering would be the largest in American history. Every major bank in New York signed on. The timing was perfect. Strike before the journalist could publish. Flood the market with optimism. Bury the truth under a mountain of capital. It almost worked. Then two things happened simultaneously. On October 12, 1848, James Porter's Atlantic and Southern Telegraph completed its line to Richmond. His first transmission was a simple cotton price report from a Virginia plantation. It arrived in Boston 30 minutes faster than American Telegraph could have carried it. More importantly, it was verifiable, accurate, and trustworthy. Merchants immediately saw the difference. Real information beats fast lies. Porter's stock began climbing. Crawford's began to waver. The same day, Robert Wells published his exposé in the Tribune. The American Telegraph Fraud: How Silas Crawford Built an Empire on Electric Lies. 4 pages of devastating detail. Beckett's documents reproduced in full. Testimony from ruined investors. Analysis of stock patterns perfectly correlating with false news. The mathematical impossibility of Crawford's reported progress versus actual construction. The market opened the next morning to chaos. American Telegraph stock didn't fall, it collapsed. From $42 to $6 in 90 minutes. Banks demanded immediate repayment of loans. Investors filed lawsuits. State legislatures launched investigations. The exclusive contracts Crawford had leveraged into monopoly suddenly became anchors dragging him to the bottom. Crawford tried to run. He made it as far as Baltimore before federal marshals arrested him at the harbor, tickets to England in his coat pocket. The man who'd promised to unite America with wires of light was led away in iron chains. Standing in his Philadelphia office, surrounded by silent telegraph keys, Thomas Becket sent one final message to Robert Wells: "It's done." The trial lasted 6 weeks and destroyed what remained of early American faith in technological progress. Prosecutors laid bare the mechanics of the fraud. Crawford had stolen nearly $8 million, an incomprehensible sum in 1848. 3 banks collapsed. Hundreds of families lost their savings. The scandal reached into Congress, where senators who'd promoted the company quietly resigned. The judge sentenced Crawford to 12 years hard labor, but the real sentence was delivered by history. He became America's first high-tech criminal, the template for every market manipulator who would follow. But the telegraph itself survived. It had to. The technology was too valuable, the promise too intoxicating. James Porter's Atlantic and Southern became the new standard, built on transparency and verified information. Other honest companies followed. Within a decade, telegraph wires truly did span the continent, carrying real news at impossible speeds, binding America together through dots and dashes of genuine communication. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Crawford's fraud had accelerated adoption by proving the value of the technology. Investors who'd been burned learned to demand verification, accountability, transparency. The regulatory frameworks born from the scandal created the foundation for modern securities law. The very lies that nearly destroyed the telegraph industry instead forced it to grow up. Wells won a Pulitzer. Becket got immunity and a job with Porter's company. Crawford rotted in prison, watching the industry he'd almost destroyed flourish without him. His wife divorced him. His children changed their names. By the time he was released in 1860, the Civil War had begun, and the telegraph was being used to coordinate armies across vast distances, exactly the strategic advantage Crawford had always imagined, now deployed by honest men for purposes both noble and terrible. The American Telegraph Company's abandoned poles still stood along southern roads for years, wooden skeletons of an empire built on electric lies. Children played around them. Birds nested in the crossbeams. The wire had been stripped and sold long ago, but the poles themselves were too expensive to remove, too worthless to matter. They stood as monuments to a simple truth Crawford had discovered and then embodied: information is only as valuable as its integrity, and integrity cannot be faked forever. The market learned its lesson. For a while. Standing in front of the New York Stock Exchange in 1850, watching legitimate telegraph companies trade at reasonable valuations based on actual infrastructure and real profits, an observer might have concluded that the age of technological fraud had ended, that Crawford's downfall had inoculated America against such schemes. That observer would have been catastrophically wrong. Crawford wasn't an aberration. He was a prototype. The methods would evolve: radio, television, internet, social media, but the core fraud remained identical. Control the information. Create the illusion. Profit from the gap between perception and reality. Repeat until caught. The empire still looked vast on the map. But everyone who paid attention knew it was just infrastructure built on trust nobody could afford to lose again. It wasn't a cautionary tale. It was just the first chapter.